June 15, 1944. 9:37 hours. Southern Kyushu. The sky was unnaturally clear, the kind of perfect blue that Japanese airmen once prayed for. But this morning, that same sky felt cursed. From the command bunker at Moji Airfield, Lieutenant Colonel Haruki Watanabe pressed his binoculars to his eyes and squinted at the high white trails slicing across the stratosphere. 30,000 feet? He muttered, disbelief tightening his voice. The shimmering contrails looked impossibly distant, like scratches on glass. Moments later, the deep, rolling echo of explosions carried down from the heavens. Not the sharp staccato of fighters, but the heavy, deliberate thunder of high-altitude bombing. "Sir, reports from Omura! Incendiaries over the naval dockyards!" shouted an officer, sliding a map across the table. Red pins marked the targets, all deep inland. Watanabe's jaw clenched. Until that week, Japanese cities had slept under the illusion that distance and geography protected them. That belief was now burning. Outside, the airbase roared to life. Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusas taxied down the runway, slender, agile fighters that once ruled the skies of China and Burma. Their pilots, young and hungry for glory, squinted upward and saw only glints of silver far beyond reach. AT-1002, Flight Leader Captain Koji Sakamoto's voice crackled through the radio. "Target sighted. Altitude unknown, above 27,000. Climbing!" Engines screamed as the Hayabusas clawed their way skyward. But as the altimeters ticked past 25,000 feet, the planes began to gasp for air. The controls stiffened. The engines strained, coughing against the thin atmosphere. Sakamoto leveled off at 28,000 feet, barely 1,000 meters below the ghostly shapes above. He could just make them out now, huge, four-engine behemoths shimmering in the morning sun. They flew in perfect formation, each the size of a small village house, their silver skins glinting like mirrors. "Impossible," he whispered. His co-pilot, Ensign Nakahara, stared in silence. "Those aren't B-24s, sir." "No," Sakamoto said, eyes wide. "Something else." At that moment, the aircraft above released their payload. Black specks tumbled earthward, thousands of them, followed by blossoms of orange fire erupting across the valley below. Down at the airfield, Watanabe could feel the shockwaves tremble through the ground. He turned to his aide. "Get me intelligence command in Tokyo. I want to know what those aircraft are." But even Tokyo didn't yet have an answer. That afternoon, when the surviving Hayabusas limped back to base, one of the pilots staggered from his cockpit, eyes wide with exhaustion. He pulled off his oxygen mask and said only one word: "Giants." The age of the B-29 Superfortress had begun. July 7, 1944. Tinian Island, Northern Marianas. The tropical wind carried the scent of aviation fuel and salt. Along the shimmering coral runway of North Field, rows of massive silver bombers stretched to the horizon, each bearing the proud insignia of the U.S. Army Air Force's 20th Air Force. Captain Walter Wally Morgan of the 73rd Bomb Wing wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked up at the machine before him. B-29 Superfortress, serial 42-24624.99 feet of wingspan. For right are 3350 duplex Cyclone engines. Pressurized cabins. Remote-controlled turrets. It was a warship disguised as an airplane. "Never thought I'd see a bomber with its own climate control," his navigator joked, tapping the fuselage. Morgan chuckled, but the humor masked all. The B-29 represented something new, something almost alien compared to the older B-17s and B-24s they had trained on. "She's not just a bomber," Morgan said. "She's a flying nation." When Boeing engineers designed the B-29, they envisioned a machine that could strike the heart of Japan, not from forward bases in China, but from beyond the reach of its defenses. With a ceiling of over 31,000 feet and a range exceeding 3,000 miles, it could reach Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya directly, And that's exactly what it began to do. At dawn on July 10th, the first full-scale mission was launched from the Marianas. Dozens of B-29s lifted into the blazing sky, the combined roar of their engines shaking the island like an earthquake. Inside one of them, the Heavenly Dancer, radio operator Sergeant Bill Larson adjusted his headset. Static crackled, and then a voice came through. All squadrons maintain altitude, 30,000 feet. Turrets on standby. Expect minimal resistance. As the formation crossed the Philippine Sea, sunlight turned the aluminum fleet into a floating armada of stars. Hours later, as they approached southern Japan, Morgan looked through his bomb sight and saw the faint outline of Yoda, Japan's steel capital, rising through a sea of clouds. Below, air raid sirens began to wail. At Moji, Lieutenant Colonel Watanabe had been awake since dawn. Reports from radar posts along the coast painted an impossible picture. Incoming aircraft, altitude 9,000 meters, multiple formations. Watanabe frowned. 9,000? That's absurd. But it was real. And it was unstoppable. Fighter squadrons scrambled once more, this time Ki-44 Shokis, faster and more powerful than the older Hayabusas. The Shoki, nicknamed Tojo by the Allies, was Japan's high-altitude answer. At 28,000 feet, Captain Sakamoto, flying his new Ki-44, finally reached the edge of the enemy formation. He could see them clearly now, giant silver aircraft in tight, disciplined rows. Their propellers shimmered in the sunlight like rotating mirrors. He fired his 12.7 mm machine guns, short, precise bursts that vanished into the cold, thin air long before they reached the bombers. The rounds simply fell away, spent by distance and drag. Then the air around him lit up. Twin .50 caliber tracers from the B-29's remote turrets whipped past his canopy. One round tore through his left wingtip. He banked sharply, diving to escape. Damn it, they're shooting from the tail, from the sides, everywhere! His wingman shouted. The B-29s continued unshaken, their formations unbroken. From the ground, Watanabe watched the spectacle with a sinking heart. The contrails didn't waver, didn't scatter, just marched steadily inland like an army of ghosts. The first wave reached Yota's Imperial Steel Works at 12:40 p.m. The bombs fell with terrifying precision. The sky filled with orange blossoms of fire. The roar of explosions rolled across the city for minutes. Japan's first encounter with the Superfortress was complete. In Tokyo, military intelligence issued a brief, grim report. New American heavy bomber sighted. Altitude exceeds interception capacity of all current fighters. Countermeasures under study. But in private, one line echoed in every officer's mind: we cannot touch them. July 12, 1944. Imperial Army Air Headquarters, Ichigaya, Tokyo. The room was heavy with smoke and silence. Maps of the Japanese homeland covered the walls, red pins for active bases, blue for anti-air defenses. But it was the new black pins, clustered across Kyushu and Honshu, that drew every pair of eyes. Each pin marked a B-29 sighting. Major General Tizo Hayashi, Chief of Air Strategy, stood before the gathered officers. His usually calm face was pale. "Gentlemen," he began, "we are facing an aircraft that flies higher, faster, and farther than anything we possess." He gestured toward the chalkboard, where a hastily sketched silhouette of the B-29 loomed. 4 engines, twin tails, massive fuselage. Its altitude, over 9,000 meters. Our Shoki barely reaches 8. Our anti-aircraft guns are effective only up to 7. An uneasy murmur rippled through the room. Lieutenant General Kawabe frowned. "Surely, this is temporary. Their bomb load must be small if they fly so high." Hayashi paused. "Each carries over 6 tons of bombs." That silenced even the skeptics. Across the table, a young intelligence officer named Lieutenant Sugimoto laid out photographs recovered from Yoda, aerial reconnaissance captured by Japanese spotters after the raid. Entire factory districts flattened, machine shops torn open like tin. Our defenses never even scratched them, he said softly. The truth settled in like winter frost. Japan's home islands were no longer beyond reach. Outside, the afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows, glinting off rows of medals pinned to crisp uniforms. But none of it felt like victory anymore. That evening, in the mess hall of Yokota Air Base, two pilots from the elite 244th Sentai sat over bowls of rice gone cold. Captain Sakamoto stirred his food without eating. His flight log lay open beside him, a record of climb rates, altitudes, failed engagements. We climbed as high as the engines would allow, he said quietly. Still, they looked like stars. Untouchable. Lieutenant Nakahara nodded. I fired everything I had. Not a single hit. They're gunners, though. He flexed his right arm, still bandaged from a turret round. They knew exactly where we were before we even came close. From the far end of the hall, an old instructor's voice cut through the gloom. Remember this, altitude is life. They have more of it than we do. For Japan's airmen, it was more than a tactical disadvantage, it was humiliation. They had spent years mastering tight turns and dogfights at low altitude, proud heirs to the Zero's dominance. Now, they faced an enemy who fought from a realm of air they could barely breathe in. Thousands of miles away, at Tinian, the American crews were feeling a different kind of tension. Captain Morgan leaned over his mission report inside the dimly lit operations tent. Minimal resistance. Minor flak damage. 2 aircraft lost to mechanical failure. Colonel Curtis LeMay, newly assigned to organize the XXI Bomber Command, nodded. They can't stop us, he said, his voice clipped and matter-of-fact. But we're not hitting hard enough yet. LeMay's reputation was already legend among bomber crews, a man who demanded efficiency over heroics. He knew that precision bombing from 30,000 feet was technically possible, but rarely effective. High winds and cloud cover scattered bomb patterns. Altitude keeps us safe, LeMay said. But safety doesn't win wars. Tokyo needs to burn. It was the first hint of what was to come, a shift in strategy that would soon redefine warfare itself. Back in Tokyo, engineers at Nakajima's Oda factory worked through sleepless nights. They experimented with turbochargers, stripped-down airframes, and the new prototype, the Ki-84-8. Higher ceiling, faster climb. Chief Engineer Noboru Hasegawa muttered, adjusting his slide rule. If we can't match their altitude, we'll meet them on the way down. But it was a race against time, and against physics. Japan's supply lines were collapsing, fuel quality degrading. Every test flight cost precious resources. By autumn, word of the B-29 spread through every military academy, every barracks, every civilian newspaper. The phrase whispered in canteens and classrooms alike was always the same. They fly where the sky ends. Even Emperor Hirohito, usually shielded from tactical details, was briefed. He listened silently as aides described how the bombers crossed the skies unchallenged, their contrails visible from Tokyo to Nagoya. He asked only one question. Can they reach the capital? No one dared to answer, and still, the raids came. From the south, from the east, from the very edge of the horizon, invisible until the sirens wailed. For Japan's defenders, it was like fighting ghosts made of metal. The realization sank in. The war had entered a new phase. The air itself had become America's strongest weapon. October 24, 1944. The skies above Nagoya, Japan. The morning began with a stillness that felt wrong, too quiet for wartime. Then, faintly, the sound came, a low hum, steady, distant, almost like thunder far out at SEA. At Atsuta Airfield, Captain Sakamoto stood beside his Ki-84-8, watching the horizon. The air shimmered in the pale autumn sun. Then, high above, so high it hurt the eyes to follow, the thin white scars appeared. Contrails bearing northwest to southeast, came the voice over the field radio. Multiple formations. Estimate 60, maybe more. Every man on the tarmac froze for a heartbeat. Then the sirens began their long, mournful wail. Engines roared to life. Ground crews scattered. Sakamoto climbed into his cockpit, the oxygen mask biting against his skin as he sealed it. "This time," he muttered, "we reached them." But even the new Hate, Japan's best hope, struggled past 32,000 feet. The climb was brutal. Every second drained power, fuel, and breath. By the time Sakamoto broke through the thin veil of cirrus cloud, his hands were trembling from oxygen deprivation. And there they were, dozens of B-29s, gliding with eerie calm across the heavens. Sunlight flashed from their wings like blades. They looked nothing like war machines, too steady, too silent. Yet the sight of them sent a chill down his spine. He rolled over, lined up his shot, and squeezed the trigger. The 20mm cannons barked, bright tracers clawing upward. He saw one round strike the fuselage of the nearest bomber. For a brief, impossible second, smoke trailed from its engine. Then the tail turret came alive. Twin streams of .50 caliber fire stitched through the air. One round shattered Sakamoto's canopy. The next tore through his right aileron. He yanked the stick, diving hard. His oxygen hose ripped free, the thin air burning his lungs. Below, the Hyade's engine coughed and sputtered as he plunged through a sea of vapor. Behind him, the contrails of the Superfortresses continued eastward, unbroken. "Tengu no Hikoki-da, they're the aircraft of the gods," one ground observer murmured, watching from the valley. In the war rooms of Tokyo, desperation grew. Radar stations were extended along the coast. Flak batteries multiplied around industrial zones. New interceptor designs, the Ki 87, J7W Shinden, even rocket-assisted prototypes, were rushed into blueprint form, but none would arrive in time. The Americans had built something beyond Japan's reach, and they knew it. By late 1944, the B-29s operated in near-total air superiority. They bombed steel works, aircraft factories, and shipyards from 30,000 feet. Their losses came mostly from engine failures or navigation errors, not enemy fire. At night, civilians in Tokyo began to notice strange constellations drifting across the darkness, clusters of faint red dots high above the clouds. Then came the hollow whistle of falling bombs, and the world below turned to fire. November 21, 1944. Tinian Island. In the glow of floodlights, Colonel Curtis LeMay stood before his crews. Maps of Japan stretched across a long wooden table: Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, Tokyo, all neatly gridded in pencil. "Gentlemen," he said, lighting a cigar, "the high-altitude precision strategy isn't giving us what we need. The winds are scattering our payloads. The targets are too small." He paused, the smoke curling around his words. "So we're changing tactics." The room fell silent. "From now on we go low. Incendiaries. We burn their cities to the ground." It was a shocking order. To trade safety for destruction. But LeMay knew, the altitude that once made the B-29 untouchable also made it imprecise. Now, he would use the bomber's long range and heavy payload to deliver something different: fire itself. Back in Japan, intelligence analysts intercepted reports of the shift. They couldn't believe it. "They will fly lower?" one officer laughed. "Then we will finally destroy them." But by early 1945, that belief would be tested, and broken, in the most devastating air raids in human history. For now, as winter settled over the islands, the contrails continued to drift like white scars across the blue. Farmers would pause in their fields, children would point upward, and soldiers would stare helplessly as those silent shapes passed overhead. And no matter how many new aircraft Japan designed, no matter how many pilots they trained, those silver fortresses ruled the heavens. It was not merely technological superiority. It was psychological warfare, fought in silence, 30,000 feet above their reach, and beneath those endless contrails, Japan braced for what was coming next. March 9, 1945. Tokyo, dense residential wards near Nyanbashi. The night arrived like any other winter evening, steam from street food stalls, the hush of factories winding down, the chatter of families settling in for the night. But on North Field, Tinian, a different kind of hush gripped the crews as the B-29s taxied into position beneath the stars. Captain Walter Morgan checked his instruments with methodical calm. The altimeter needle would not be his guide tonight, it would be the cityscape below. Colonel Curtis LeMay had ordered the change months earlier: low altitude, nighttime incendiary attacks to exploit the wooden construction that still dominated Japanese residential areas. The B-29s, trimmed for range and loaded with hundreds of M69 incendiary clusters and napalm-like mixtures, were to descend beneath cloud cover and release at 5,000 to 8,000 feet. Precision would be sacrificed for overwhelming effect. Remember, LeMay had told them, this will be different. We want fires, not precision holes in factory roofs. Morgan felt the weight of that sentence as he climbed into the chill stratospheric night. His bombardier, Lieutenant James O'Rourke, ran a final check on the Norden-like sighting equipment adapted for low-level runs. The crew, hardened by months over Japan, moved with the efficiency of men who had accepted moral ambiguity as part of the JOB.AT-2345. Over the dark sea, the first formation turned toward Honshu. Radio silence held. Below, Tokyo slept, unaware. On the streets of Nyanbashi, Masako Fujita, a seamstress, mother of two, had been mending a child's coat by the glow of a kerosene lamp. The air raid sirens had been unreliable lately. Most people trusted the older routine of boiling water and listening for contrails. Tonight, she heard nothing until a distant rumble grew into a mechanical roar that swallowed conversation and thought. Bombers, her neighbor whispered, eyes skyward. Too many. Within minutes, the first incendiaries fell. They were tiny, smoking darts that penetrated rooftops and burst into small, furious fires. As more clusters came in, the small blazes coalesced. Wooden eaves, rice paper sliding doors, narrow alleys, everything that made Tokyo human and intimate turned into tinder. Masako grabbed her children and fled into the night. The street lamps were useless now. Thick smoke rolled like an advancing wall. She could hear the keening of air raid wardens, the distant whistles of trains stopped mid-route, people calling names. But above it all was the relentless, metallic heartbeat of the Superfortresses. On board the Heavenly Dancer, the first fires were visible as orange blooms below, a galaxy of small stars becoming constellations of flame. The bombardier released his M69 clusters in timed sweeps, watching the pattern form on his map. The men exchanged few words. The radios were muted and the crew worked like surgeons. We're lighting a city. The navigator muttered, voice flat. No one smiled. They all knew what the order meant: civilians, homes, the infrastructure of daily life. They also believed it would shorten the war. That conviction steadied hands as the bomber rolled and drifted. Below, crisis spiraled into catastrophe. The narrow streets of Tokyo, clogged with flammable material and people, turned into choked funnels of heat and smoke. Firestorms, once the province of volcanic literature and apocalyptic metaphor, became grim reality. Their winds roared, fanning flames into walls that ate whole neighborhoods in minutes. The Imperial Fire Department, lacking sufficient water and equipment, could not contain the spread. Hospital wards overflowed with burned victims, makeshift shelters filled with the dazed and the grieving. Messages were sent to the War Ministry, and the words read out in hushed, stunned tones. Urban conflagration throughout eastern Tokyo. Civil defense overwhelmed. Back in the command centers, Lieutenant Colonel Haruki Watanabe watched the live reports with a growing numbness. His pilots had tried, as always, to reach the attackers, but at night, low-level B-29s were a different enemy. They slipped in under cloud cover, released their incendiaries, and vanished into the dark like ghosts. Radar often picked them up too late. Searchlights, intended for high-altitude defense, were ineffective against the low-level, high-speed runs. Watanabe boxed his hands into his sleeves and listened as engineers described rushed countermeasures, improved searchlight coordination, night fighter units trained for low-altitude interception, and experimental upward-firing guns. The key 87 projects were accelerated. The rocket-assisted interceptors and the J-7W Shinden prototypes were pressed harder to flight testing. The nation's aircraft designers worked in a fever, but each suggestion came with the same bitter caveat: production bottlenecks, fuel shortages, and the time it would take to produce meaningful numbers. "You cannot unmake what has already burned," Watanabe told the map, though the map would not answer. In the days after March 9th, the photographs from reconnaissance planes were taut with horror. Blocks once teeming with life were essentially erased. Where streets had been, there were now ragged voids of ash and twisted metal. The casualty estimates were staggering. Families were gone. Neighborhoods decimated. The psychological effect was deeper even than the physical, the idea that the homeland was penetrable, that the sanctity of private life no longer had safe boundaries. Meanwhile, the American crews who had flown the mission saw their reports filtered through military objectives and cold statistics. Tonnage dropped, fires started, sorties completed. Some crews wrote letters home in which their words stumbled over the reality of what they had done. Others recorded a grim satisfaction, believing their sacrifice and action would shorten the war and save more lives in the long run. In the weeks that followed, incendiary raids became a staple of the campaign. Cities across Honshu were targeted in systematic rotation. LeMay's strategy was unyielding: deprive the Japanese economy and civilian support network of the means to continue. Each raid further eroded the defenders' morale while straining the thin fabric of civil order. By spring of 1945, Japan was fighting a rearguard air war, inventing weapons out of desperation and training pilots on machines that might never reach maturity. Kamikaze units were forming for naval targets. On the home front, children practiced blackout drills as nightly ash drifted into their hair. The word B-29 acquired a mythic, fearful cadence. Parents hush-whispered it like a curse. And yet, even as Japan's engines sputtered, planners and pilots continued to resist, in the air and in the city. They tested new tactics: head-on attacks to exploit the B-29's blind spots, massed night fighter intercepts with upward-firing armament, even suicide missions against the enormous bombers. Each tactic cost lives and produced only temporary, localized successes. The Superfortress remained a persistent, punishing force. For the people beneath that sky, life contracted into a grim ledger: one more raid, one more night spent in a shelter, one more name crossed off someone's list. For the bomber crews above, each mission added another decimal to the war's balance sheet. Lives taken, objectives met, the uncertain arithmetic of victory. The B-29 had not merely changed how bombs fell. It had remade the relationship between air power and the human geography of cities, a change whose echoes would outlast the war itself. April 1945. Osaka Air Defense Command, Japan. The war had turned inward. Once, Japan's military maps showed vast Pacific holdings: the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Burma. Now, the pins and flags were gone, leaving only the home islands, scarred and hollowed out by months of fire. Inside the Osaka Air Defense Command, Lieutenant Colonel Haruki Watanabe looked over the latest reports. B-29s had struck Kobe the night before, 280 aircraft, flying under 8,000 feet, laying down lines of fire across the harbor. The docks were gone. The arsenal destroyed. The city's heart, another blackened scar on the map. "Intercepts?" he asked quietly. A staff officer replied. 35 aircraft scrambled, sir. 15 engaged. None returned." Watanabe nodded once, then folded his hands behind his back. He didn't curse. He didn't shout. There was nothing left to shout for. At Atami Airfield, a squadron of Ki-61 Hien fighters prepared for another night mission. The pilots were young, many barely 20. Their aircraft, lightweight and elegant, had once matched Allied fighters in agility. But against the Superfortress, they were gnats before giants. Sergeant Akio Tanabe stood beside his machine, tracing the red Hinomaru on the fuselage with a gloved hand. He had lost his brother over Kyushu, his mentor over Nagoya, and his sense of invincibility over Tokyo. Yet still, he flew. As dust deepened, the mechanics fueled the planes with bitter-smelling, low-octane fuel, synthetic blends that sputtered even before takeoff. The maintenance crews worked in silence, their faces expressionless. The mission briefing was simple: intercept the B-29 formation heading toward Osaka. Engage at any cost. Return if possible. Remember, the commander said, our duty is not survival. Our duty is the defense of the homeland. At 22:10, the hence lifted into the cold night. Over the inland sea, the sky bloomed with red. Searchlights swept in erratic arcs, grasping at the unseen. Then came the low, heavy thunder, B-29s inbound, their engine drones merging into a single monstrous vibration. Tanabe's altimeter read 6,000 meters. His breath fogged the cracked canopy. Suddenly, the black sky above erupted with orange tracers, the unmistakable pattern of defensive fire. There! He shouted into his radio. He pushed the throttle, diving toward the lights. For an instant, a massive silhouette filled his vision, the underbelly of a B-29, glowing in the searchlight beams, its turrets flashing like stars. Tanabe fired. His 20mm shells struck the right wing. A moment later, a plume of flame trailed from one of the bomber's engines. The giant began to veer sluggishly, yet somehow still climbing. Hit confirmed! He shouted. But then his canopy exploded, shards slicing into his cheek. The tail gunner had found him. The Hien spun out, controls frozen, engine stuttering. In the final seconds before he hit the sea, Tanabe saw it again, the ghostly formation above him, calm, steady, unstoppable. By the following morning, Osaka burned. The firestorm reached temperatures no one thought possible. Asphalt melted. Rivers boiled. Tens of thousands were gone. The official communiqué from the Imperial General Headquarters read only: enemy air raid caused severe damage to urban area. Civilian morale remains unshaken. But everyone knew it was a lie. Across Japan, rumors spread like smoke. Some said the Americans had built a new engine that didn't need air. Others whispered the bombers were unmanned, that no human could fly that high, that fast, for that long. To many civilians, the B-29s were no longer machines. They were Kami no Tsubasa, wings of the gods, instruments of fate itself. Far away on Guam, the men who flew those machines were weary beyond measure. Captain Morgan had flown 12 missions over Japan. He no longer celebrated returns. Every time, his navigator O'Rourke said, it looks the same from up there. Just orange. Morgan nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. Doesn't look like victory anymore. Just fire. He didn't say it, but everyone knew what he meant. For all their success, the missions had become mechanical acts of destruction. Each one chipped away at something unseen inside them. Colonel LeMay, meanwhile, had no time for sentiment. His briefings were precise, clipped, clinical. The goal was efficiency, not emotion. Yet even he understood the magnitude of what he was commanding. The B-29 had achieved what no air weapon before it could. It had made the sky itself an empire. By the raids expanded into every major industrial and urban center. Kobe. Yokohama. Nagoya again. One by one, the cities dimmed under the storm of fire. At night, survivors climbed to high hills to watch, cities glowing red at the horizon like molten metal, their smoke merging with the clouds. The old poetry of Japan, the moon, the cherry blossom, the fleeting life, now felt like prophecy. In what remained of the Imperial Air Staff, a few officers spoke of counterattacks, of secret weapons, of hope. But others, like Watanabe, knew the truth. The war had been lost the moment the B-29 appeared. June 1945. Tokyo. Under the pale light of dawn, Watanabe walked through the ruins of the capital. The air smelled of cinders and rain. Among the wreckage lay the twisted remains of an anti-air gun, its barrel pointing skyward, silent, defeated. He stopped beside it and whispered to no one. They built a machine that turned the heavens against us. He looked up, at the sky so bright and empty, and wondered if somewhere above that calm blue, another formation of silver fortresses was already on its way. The war was not over. But the outcome was written there, in the air itself. March 9, 1945. 22:30 hours. Over Tokyo Bay. The night was still, the air heavy with anticipation. Below, the city of Tokyo slept in darkness, its streets blacked out, its people exhausted by months of air raid alarms that usually amounted to nothing. But far above that slumbering city, at 7,000 feet, far lower than usual, something massive was approaching. Captain Emmett McIntyre, pilot of the Lonesome Lady, tightened his grip on the control yoke. Around him, wave after wave of B-29s filled the night sky, 334 bombers in total, the largest air raid force ever assembled over Japan. The mission was not high-altitude precision this time. It was annihilation. AT-2240. The order came through the radio from General Curtis LeMay's command. Commence operation. Load Tokyo. The bay beneath them glowed faintly in the moonlight. McIntyre flipped the release switch, and the belly of his B-29 opened like a wound. Out poured hundreds of M69 incendiary bomblets, each a small, napalm-filled cylinder designed to ignite on impact. They fell silently at first, slicing through the night air like falling stars. Then, impact. A spark. A flash, and suddenly entire districts ignited. Within minutes, Tokyo was no longer a city, it was a single, continuous firestorm. The wood and paper houses that once defined its beauty now fueled its destruction. Flames leapt from block to block, merging into one roaring sea of heat that climbed thousands of feet into the air. From the cockpit of the Lonesome Lady, the crew could see it all, a rising pillar of flame visible even from 150 miles away. "My God!" whispered Sergeant Harris, the bombardier. "We've lit up the whole damn island." On the ground, air raid sirens screamed too late. Civilians stumbled through the choking smoke, clutching buckets of water that boiled before they could use them. The heat melted the soles of shoes, seared lungs with every breath. Rivers boiled. Wind gusts created by the inferno sucked people off their feet. In the command center at Ichigaya, Japanese officers stood in stunned silence as reports flooded in. Downtown lost. Ueno district engulfed. Water pressure failing. Fire spreading across the Sumida River. By dawn, more than 16 square miles of Tokyo lay in ashes. An estimated 100,000 civilians were dead. Lieutenant Colonel Watanabe, the same officer who had once stared up at the first B-29s over Kyushu, sat in his bunker that morning with his head in his hands. He had no words left. Only a thought that would echo through his mind for the rest of his life: the gods have left Japan. Across the Pacific, General LeMay looked at reconnaissance photos with cold precision. "We've found the way to end it," he said simply. The B-29 had not just conquered altitude, it had conquered the very idea of untouchability. But even as Tokyo burned, the men who flew those missions wrestled with the weight of what they'd done. McIntyre's co-pilot wrote in his journal that night, "We did what we were ordered to do. But if this is victory, it feels hollow." Back in Japan, the Air Defense Command scrambled to respond. New tactics were proposed: ramming attacks, night interceptions, desperate measures. The young pilots of the Shinbutai, special attack units, volunteered in droves, willing to sacrifice their lives to stop the uncatchable silver giants. And yet, nothing worked. The B-29s came by day, by night, from the Mariana Islands, from Tinian, Saipan, and Guam. They came from beyond the horizon, beyond the imagination of Japan's planners. The war in the air was now one-sided. The Empire's skies no longer belonged to its warriors. But the Superfortress still had one final mission left, one that would change history forever. August 6, 1945. 2:45 hours. Northfield, Tinian Island. The tropical air was thick and still. Beneath floodlights, the silver fuselage of a B-29 gleamed like a blade. Painted on its nose was a simple name, Enola Gay. The ground crews moved with solemn precision, tightening bolts, checking fuses, whispering as if afraid to disturb the silence. Inside the bomb bay, a single device hung from steel braces. Little boy. A 9,700-pound uranium bomb unlike anything ever built before. Few on the island knew its true nature, even fewer understood the power it contained. Colonel Paul Tibbets, commander of the 509th Composite Group, stood beside his aircraft, hands clasped behind his back. His orders were sealed, his expression unreadable. At 2:58 he climbed aboard, settled into the left seat, and gave the nod. Let's go. At 2:45, Enola Gay lifted from the runway, its four Wright R-3350 engines roaring into the darkness. The destination, Hiroshima. 6 hours later, the city lay beneath them, calm and unsuspecting. It was 8:15. The morning market had just opened. Children walked to school. Housewives hung laundry on balconies. From the bombardier's position, Major Thomas Farabee called out, "Target in sight. AIOI bridge, dead center." Tibbets gave the order. "Bomb away." The aircraft jolted upward, relieved of its deadly cargo. The bomb fell silently for 43 seconds. Then, light data flashed brighter than the sun. A sphere of fire consuming the heart of Hiroshima, expanding with impossible speed. The shockwave struck Enola Gay moments later, tossing the bomber like a toy in a storm. Tibbets steadied the controls. "What was that?" cried Tail Gunner Sergeant DeHart. "Don't look back!" shouted Farabee. But it was too late. The men who turned saw the world ending below them. Where the city had stood was now a boiling cloud, rising 20,000 feet, glowing orange at its core. Fires stretched for miles. The streets had vanished, the riverbeds filled with steam. People had been erased, leaving only shadows burned into walls. At that same hour, hundreds of miles away in Tokyo, Lieutenant Colonel Haruki Watanabe received a coded report. "Unknown weapon, entire city destroyed." He stared at the message in disbelief, the paper trembling in his hand. "One bomb?" he asked quietly. "Yes, sir," replied his aide. "One aircraft, one bomb." He sank into his chair. The sky had turned against them long ago, but now it had become something divine, merciless and absolute. 3 days later, August 9th, another B-29 boxcar dropped a second weapon over Nagasaki. The war that once began with surprise attacks from the air now ended the same way, sudden, unstoppable, and from beyond reach. By August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's voice echoed across the nation, announcing surrender. "The enemy has employed a new and most cruel bomb," he said, "the power of which to do damage is incalculable." The same officers who had once laughed at American bombers in 1942 now sat in silence, heads bowed, unable to speak. Japan's skies were empty, no fighters, no interceptors, only ghosts. At Northfield, the crews of the 509th stood beside their B-29s as news of surrender spread. Some cheered. Some cried. And some, like Tibbets, simply stared at the horizon, their triumph heavy as lead. For the Japanese officers who had first seen the B-29 appear a year earlier, tiny silver dots gliding above the clouds, it had been a revelation. They had looked up at those unreachable machines and whispered, "Impossible." By the end of 1945, that word had come to define everything about the war's final chapter. The Superfortress had not just flown above their fighters. It had flown above history itself.